Hi, good morning. This is a quick overview of today's notes. We're on the second half of week 21, Thursday, Friday notes, and we're talking a little bit about natural selection. Really, the entire class is kind of led up to this part when we're talking about how genes work, how alleles work, how traits get passed on from one generation to the next. And it all begins with Darwin. It all begins with the work of his travels on the HMS Beagle, where he spent 5 years in the 1800s, in the 19th century, traveling from England down around South America, especially in the Galapagos Islands, doing observations and checking out how traits get passed from generation to generation. Now, we've kind of started backward from Darwin a little bit. We started at the mechanisms, the chemistry, DNA, things that Darwin did not know about, and now we're going into, okay, how does it actually work? Darwin, which is awesome, did it starting from observations. He didn't understand exactly the mechanisms of inheritance, had no idea about DNA, but through observations was able to tell that certain characteristics get passed down and get selected for in nature. So let's check out a quick overview of this. First of all, in geology, we talked a little bit about the rock cycle. Very important to check out the rock cycle because the sedimentary layers give us fossil evidence for evolution, for slow change over time. We also talked a little bit about, again, the basic chemistry, the base pairs of DNA, the 4 base pairs that make the code of life. The 5-year voyage, 1831 to 1836, aboard the HMS Beagle. And especially when you're looking at the changes that Darwin then brought back to England, but the samples that Darwin then brought back to England, he was able to write up his Origin of Species, one of the most important books in all of science. Quick example right here. Excuse me. The peppered moth is kind of a classic example when we talk about natural selection. If you're looking at birch trees, which you may or may not know have kind of a whitish bark to them, not totally white, they've got some gray in them, some speckles. But during the Industrial Revolution, coal plants, remember coal, a fossil fuel, you're burning the remains of once living things. It's in these long carbon compounds. But coal burns very dirty. In other words, it puts out these big clouds of smoke. During the early days in the Industrial Revolution, especially in England, you would have this soot, this dark smoke, kind of coat these white trees. Now, on these white trees, there lived a peppered moth. Now, it was mostly white, although it did have the ability to have, black colored offspring or darker colored offspring as well. Mostly they were white. And if you think about camouflage, they blended in with their environment. They were white moths on a white tree. Yes, black moths did show up, or darker moths did show up, but the birds could see those more easily. They stood out against the white bark, and they were picked off more easily. Now think about it. If you're a black peppered moth or a darker colored pepper moth, you're not going to be passing on your genes at the same rate that, say, the white one is, because, is my bad picture down here, the white peppered moths, they kind of blend in much better. They've got better camouflage. But then the Industrial Revolution comes along. These white trees get this kind of black sooty coating to them. And what you're seeing is now the white moths are standing out. In the population of peppered moths, you've got more white moths now getting picked off the trees because they stand out more. The black peppered moss is now selected for. In other words, the characteristic of having a darker color now gets selected for naturally. This is called natural selection right here because nature is doing the selecting. In other words, the birds are looking at the tree, they're seeing the contrast between the black and the white peppered moss against either a white tree, as they are naturally, or the darker trees after they get covered with soot from the Industrial Revolution. Interestingly enough, since coal is kind of gone by the wayside, the trees are now much whiter again. There's not as much black soot being thrown up into the air in England as there once was, and the peppered moths have now reverted to much more of their offspring being whiter again, and the darker ones again have a disadvantage. So when you're talking natural selection, you're talking about genes getting passed on because they get selected for. As a matter of fact, nowhere in Darwin's Origin of Species does he ever use the term evolution, but that's come to be what it means. Quick example coming up of artificial selection. Artificial selection is when humans select for a certain trait. You might think about this if you have, for example, a dog being the classic example. I'm also going to give an example in class today of a crab, of all things, a Heike crab. You might remember, for example, fuzzy wuzzes. We use those as a made-up creature to talk about one single trait, fuzziness, in other words, furriness. If the climate changes, again, the furry ones have an advantage. If it gets colder, they can retain their heat better. That was the idea behind that, the cartoon creatures up here. If the climate gets warmer, again, the less fuzzy wuzzes have an advantage because they can get rid of their heat more easily. Natural selection has to do with changes in the environment, selecting for a particular trait in a species, in a plant or animal. If you check out artificial selection, the example I'm going to give in class today is about Heike crabs. We'll talk about dogs more specifically next week. But if you check out the Heike crab, there's a crab in Japan that happens to look, the back of the crab, the carapace you call that of the crab, the shell really. It looks a little bit like a human face. I'll put the picture of this online, but it's got like a scowl. It looks like a samurai warrior almost. And there was a huge battle that took place in this particular place where these crabs are found. And people might say, well, wait a second, how did a crab end up with a human face? Well, it turns out if you were a person pulling crabs out of the ocean as part of your living, if you're fishing for a living, and you pick up a batch full of crabs and you look at one of them and it happens to have a human kind of face on it just by chance. Because if you look at the back of a crab, those patterns on the back of a crab shell are totally random, pretty much by chance. You might not be quite so anxious to eat one that looks a little bit like a person's face. You might say, well, wait a second here, I'm not so sure about these. I've got these other crab, we'll cook those up, we'll sell those in the market. This one, I'm gonna toss back. What you've just done is artificially selected. Artificial selection is when humans do it. You've artificially selected for this characteristic, for a crab with a human-looking face on his back, on his carapace, on his backside. Again, I'll show a quick clip from an old Carl Sagan video, but it's a very, very good video on this. And it talks about a large battle that took place in this area. A lot of samurai died in this battle. And especially if you're just a little bit superstitious, you might look at this and say, I'm not gonna eat that. Toss it back. Now that crab can go on, pass on its genes, pass on its characteristics, its traits. It has a better chance of passing on its genes and traits to the next generation than, say, a crab that doesn't look like a person. So if we're talking about selection, whether it's artificial selection, when people do it, or natural selection, when changes in the environment do it, the entire bit of studying that we've been doing here on chemistry, on how the earth changes over time, has led up to us talking about Darwin and his Origin of Species book, probably the most important biology text in all of biology text. That's where I'm going to leave it today. These notes will be posted up there online. Have yourself a wonderful week 21. See you next time online. Bye-bye.